Hello, everyone. How are you guys doing? Really, how are you guys doing? So I'm here today to talk to you about gender parity in elected office. Um, I'm going to start by reading off some names that are very important for our theme of Lost and Found. Eva Clayton, Corinne Brown, Leslie Brine, Maria Cantwell, Pat Denner, Jennifer Dunn, Karen English, Anna Eshu, Tilly Flower, Elizabeth Furse, Jane Harmon, Nydia Velasquez, Edith Johnson, Carolyn Maloney, Marjorie Margolis, Cynthia McKinney, Carrie Meek, Deborah Price, Lucille Roybal Allard, Lynn Shenick, Karen Shepard, Karen Thurman, Lynn Woolsey, Barbara Boxer, Carol Mosley Brown, Patty Murray K. Hutchinson, Jocelyn Burdick, Diane Feinstein. 1993 was the year of the woman. In total, 30 women were elected to Congress for the first time. Now, 25 years later, 2018 is being heralded as this generation's year of the woman. But before we move forward to the actualization of future progress towards gender parity in elected office, let's reflect on what the world would look like and what our lives would look like if we actually had gender parity in elected office. So I'm going to ask you guys to go on a little vision journey with me now. Close your eyes if you feel comfortable. And imagine a world where 50% of the population is male and 50% of the population is female. This shouldn't be difficult. We're about there right now. And then I want you to think about, what if 50% of our world leaders were women and 50% of our world leaders were men? Can you imagine it? What do the conversations sound like? What are the issues we're addressing? If international politics might be too much of a reach for you, think about the United States. Imagine if 50% of everyone in Congress were women. What do those conversations sound like now? What are the issues that are swimming in your head right now? Now, let's think about California. What if 50% of all elected offices in California were held by women? 50% of the state legislature represented by women. 50% of your local city councils, your school boards, represented by women. 50% of your college districts represented by women. What do those issues look like? What do those conversations sound like? What are those compromises that we very well need sound like? So I'm going to ask all of you to come back, take a step back to reality. Wasn't that a wonderful, amazing image that you just created in your head of true representation? Now, as I mentioned, 50% of the world, roughly 50%, it's about 49.8% of the world's population is women. However, here's the real truth. Global gender parity in elected office, as compiled by data put together by the Interparliamentary Union of 190 nations, women only make up 23.3% of all elected office in the world. Now, I know as we think about international politics right now, there's a lot of dissent that's happening, right? There's a lot of rise and falls of dictatorships. And in some nations like Saudi Arabia, women just got the right to vote for the very first time. So from a global perspective, it might seem like this is a great achievement. And so when we scope down into the United States, one would expect that those numbers increase dramatically, right? We are the number one democracy in the world. We herald the idea and push forward the idea of representative democracies. We base our elections off of this idea. And so one would expect that in the United States, it looks a little bit more 50-50. But before we delve into the United States, I want to point out some of the other countries. Mexico, here in our hemisphere, is at about 42% of gender parity. Oh, spoiler alert, there's the United States. The United Arab Emirates is about 20%. That's right. The United Arab Emirates is at 20% gender parity. Rwanda is leading the way at 61.3%. Sub-Saharan Africa is at 23.8%. The European Union and other Western civilization could use a little work. They're at 24.9%. And Nordic countries as a whole are at about 41.7%. So I want you to look up here, and I want you to see where the United States lands in this chart. The greatest democracy in the world sits right above Sub-Saharan Africa when it comes to gender parity. We are 100th out of 190 nations when it comes to gender parity in elected office. We've got a lot of work to do. Now, it might a great argument against this is like, well, what if there just aren't as many women in the United States as there are men, right? Then maybe our elected population is equivalent. Our elected officials do represent our population. However, as of the 2010 census, men made up 50.8% of the population and women 49.2%. So we are right there at 50-50. Here's where our 23% actually comes from. Women make up less than 19% of Congress. That includes, my figure's on, that's fine. Women make up about 20% of Congress, 24% of state legislatures, so who represents you on a statewide level. And when we look at executive offices, we're actually really suffering here. Women make up 10% of governors and 19% of all mayors in our 100 largest cities. We have a problem when it comes to executive offices. We have a problem when it comes to all elected offices as far as gender parity, but think about the idea of women as leaders and how that translates into these percentages for executive offices. Now, great news, we're in California. California has done some really good things around getting women elected. We're one of the only states that have 2 women represent us in the US Senate. And so there's hope there, right? We are California. Population of California, ladies, we're in the majority. We're at 50.2%. Men, it's okay. You're fine. You can handle this. You're at 49.8%. And so when you think about California and the progressive nature of the state, you almost expect that we are like right up there, right? Like we're going to be leaps and bounds ahead of all of our other states. We're going to be on par with like New York, the other progressive hub of the nation. What if I was to tell you that California was bookended by Iowa and Texas when it comes to gender parity? We rank 32nd in the country for gender parity. Good morning. Now, that's not to say that a lot of work hasn't already happened in the state of California in electing women to office. This is a breakdown of all of our statewide elected offices. All of our state-level elected offices. So we have a total of 40 people in our Senate, 30 of them are men, 9 of them are women, 1 vacant seat, a total of 80 people or 80 assembly members, 59 of them are men, 18 of them are women, and 3 are currently open vacant seats. So when we look at representation in the legislature, women make up 23% of the legislature. And this is as of like 2 weeks ago. A month ago, this number looked very different. And do you know what caused the increase in the percentage of women in elected office on a statewide level in California? Vacancies. Because we had vacancies, we saw a 2% increase in representation of women. Now, everyone, in the work that I do, I often find that a lot of women are worried about running for office. There are all of these like myths that exist out in the nether universe on why it's more difficult for women to run, or why women don't self-select to run, right? We hear this often, like women aren't choosing to run for office, and that's really what the big problem is. So I want to take a couple of minutes to bust some of these myths. And this is specifically for the women in the room today. Myth number 1, I am not qualified to run for office. This is a myth that we are seeing disappear the more we engage in conversations like this. Recently, especially given that this year is an election year, we are seeing men come out of the woodwork and run for every office. And you know the question that they don't ask themselves? Am I qualified? Women, on the other hand, we sit there and we put together our resume and we evaluate the job description and we match everything up and we say, are we qualified for the role that we are about to run for? And so as we continue to engage in these conversations and as we see the increase in the women's movement and the rise of women taking action in politics, we're starting to see the I am not qualified to run for office myth dissipate, because it's not a reality, it's a perception. Myth number 2, I must be asked to run. There's this statement in the political world that a woman has to be asked to run for office 7 times before she decides to do it. 7 times. This is a myth. You don't need to be asked to run for office. If you are a registered voter where you are qualified to run for office, you are eligible to run for office, and you do not need to be asked to run for office. Myth number 3, campaigns are expensive. I need to be wealthy. We're seeing more and more local municipalities and states actually moving to public campaign financing. But it's also not all of your money that you're putting into these elections. You go out and you fundraise money, so you don't have to be independently wealthy in order to win elections. Myth number 4, which is one of my favorites, I need to know every issue and every position on those issues before I can run for office. You don't need to know every issue and every position, you just need to know where you can find the information. Myth number 5, I need to be perfect. And this is one that I hear more and more from women, and let's call it for what it is. This is the patriarchy, ladies. You don't need to be perfect. If you feel like you need to be perfect, think about your elected officials right now. Are they perfect? Last one, women don't win elections. This is the biggest myth that is out there right now, and the biggest deterrent for a lot of women who are interested in running for office. They say, well, women just don't win. What if I was to tell you that when women get their names on the ballot, they win at the same rate as men? It's true. If women get their names on the ballot, if you file to run for office, you win at the same rate as men. There is no stigma that exists that women don't get elected. So I'm going to take you guys a little bit into the work of Emerge California, just to set the tone for some of the successes and some of the challenges that we have received from our alumna. So we have about 457 women who've been trained over the last 15 years. 55% of them are women of color, and we have about a 70% win rate. I say all of this to say that we surveyed our program members and our graduates, and we asked them, what are the biggest challenges that you are seeing right now? And the challenges that they identified were endorsements, money, influence, this questionable word, viability. How many people have heard the word viability? And then the last one is skills, right? Like, if you don't know how the political system functions, if you don't know how it works, how are you expected to put on a whole new campaign? And we dug down with them a little bit more on these top issues, and we identified one big thing that connected all of it: the good old boys club, AKA the patriarchy in politics. Right now, the way that our political system is structured and it's based off of people who've operated in the political space for a very long time. We already went through the representation numbers of women in elected office. What we didn't do is the mirror side of that, which is the numbers of men in elected office. When you are about 74% of the elected, of all elected offices in the state of California, you're naturally going to be more inclined to have access to endorsements, money, skills, viability, and influence. And when I say influence, I don't just mean political influence, I mean the kind of influence where you can get in front of a camera and your message is covered. Influence. If you have people who are shepherding you through the process, it's actually a lot easier for you to get access to those important things that you need in order to win a campaign. I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about viability. Have folks heard the word viability been tossed around in elections? When a new candidate kind of puts in their papers, they show up, they're excited, they're eager, they know the issues that are affecting their community, they want to represent them, and then they often get the term, "You are not a viable candidate." Well, I would be a lot more viable if you actually invested and believed in my campaign, right? If the old institutions that protect our political system gave credibility to some of these new candidates, especially to women, then they would be instantly more viable. So, what are some solutions to breaking the barriers set forth by our ongoing challenges? One, the most important solution, shifting our electoral messaging. Let's change up what it is we talk about. Women bring a very different perspective to our political environment. We talk about real issues that impact our communities. We share our feelings, we share our thoughts, we also do the research and come up with solutions to them. So we don't have to stand up in front of media and talk about how we're gonna win. We don't have to talk about how much money we raised. We can actually talk about the issues that matter and impact our populace. What we say at Emerge is be unapologetically you. You know why? It's refreshing. Politics is so stuffy and so boring, and the mundaneness that we hear from DC and at the Capitol is just ongoing, and the perspective that you bring when you're unapologetically you shatters all of that. The second most important thing is skills development. Make sure you're learning how to build a campaign, volunteer for campaigns, learning how to raise money, and learning how to earn endorsements. Right? There are strategies that go towards how you can get credibility from some of these institutional organizations. And so having the skills development around that can shift an entire campaign for an individual woman. Lastly, the biggest thing to counter the good old boys network is the sisterhood. Women supporting other women who are interested in running for office. Women giving up their pro bono time as campaign managers to help strategically plan the campaigns for women. Mobilizing, knocking on doors, making phone calls, donating, contributing, funding campaigns, and lastly, just providing that sisterhood support that's so important for a first-time woman candidate running for office. Here is one of my favorite quotes. When RBG was asked about gender equality on the Supreme Court, she said, "There will be enough women on the Supreme Court when there are 9. Because for the longest time, there have always been 9 male Supreme Court justices at the United States Supreme Court. So, while gender parity is a wonderful goal to aspire to, and 2018 is the year of the woman, we have a long way to go to shift the balance that exists in our political system. Thank you, everyone.